And welcome back to Abnormal Psychology. In this lecture, we're going to cover Chapter 14, which is Schizophrenia Spectrum Disorders. Start off with the definition, psychosis. Psychosis is a state defined by loss of contact with reality. The ability to perceive and respond to the environment is significantly disturbed and functioning is obviously impaired. Symptoms may include hallucinations or delusions. And psychosis may be substance-induced, caused by brain injury, but most psychosis appear in the form of schizophrenia, and that is what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. Schizophrenia affects approximately 1 out of 100 people in the world. At this point when I'm recording the lecture, there's about 2.5 million Americans, although that number is going to be rising. And I certainly will not test you on that number because that number is going to be larger as the time goes on. Financial and emotional costs are enormous, and sufferers have an increased risk of suicide and physical and often fatal illnesses. So there are a lot of issues that go along with schizophrenia, and it impacts not just the individual, but also their families and society as a whole. So with schizophrenia, you can find people that have schizophrenia across all socioeconomic groups, but there is a disproportionate number of people that have schizophrenia in the lower levels. So in impoverished communities, there are more people that have schizophrenia. And some people believe that the stress of poverty has an impact on the disorder. So in other words, because there is an enormous amount of stress related to living an impoverished life. So does that impact having schizophrenia, or is it that if you have schizophrenia, you're not able to maintain having a job and therefore you end up being unemployed, perhaps homeless, and living a life that would be in the lower socioeconomic levels. And of course, we don't know that, but what we do know is when you look across the different socioeconomic groups, we do see that schizophrenia is disproportionate in the lower socioeconomic groups. So I want to go over the diagnostic criteria, and this is coming directly from the DSM. So for 1 month, you need to have at least 2 or more of the following symptoms for much of the time. You need to have delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, abnormal motor activity, including catatonia and negative symptoms. And we'll go over what all these different things are in this lecture. 2, you need to have at least one of the individual symptoms must be. So you need to have at least delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. So that has to be there. 3, the individual functions much more poorly in various life spheres than was the case prior to the symptoms. And 4, beyond this 1 month of intense symptomology, the individual continues to display some degree of impaired functioning for at least 5 additional months. So we'll go over what these different symptoms, what they would look like, and hopefully you'll have a much clearer idea at the end of this lecture. So what are the symptoms of schizophrenia? Well, basically we can divide them into 3 general categories. We have the positive symptoms, the negative symptoms, and the psychomotor symptoms. Okay, so I'm going to break them first into the positive and negative symptoms. Now, the positive and negative are not like you would think, like positive meaning good and negative meaning bad. In the case of schizophrenia and other psychological disorders, a positive symptom is one that adds a behavior, a thought, or a feeling, whereas a negative symptom takes away a behavior, thought, or feeling. So with a positive symptom, we're going to see some bizarre additions to the person's normal way of thinking or acting. And these include delusions, which are faulty ways of interpreting reality, or hallucinations, which we'll talk about as we go along. So these pathological excesses or bizarre additions to the person's behavior. Delusions can have a variety of bizarre content, such as being controlled by someone else. They can be persecution, so the person believes that they are being persecuted by somebody else. They can be a reference, and what that has to do is the person might take something innocuous. They may think that something of everyday has some special meaning to them. So, for example, they might see a robin hopping around outside, and that might have special meaning, and that could mean that something bad's going to happen today. So they'll take something, and that means something very special. With grandeur, they might think that they are especially important or bright or rich. They may think that they have special control over things. With disorganized thinking and speech, you can have people who have loose associations. So they may say things like, he went to the ballpark and he bought Frank's beer home and a bag of grass seed. And they'll talk to you, and to them, they're making sense, but it makes no sense to you. They may perseverate on something, so they get fixated on a topic and they just keep going on and on and on. Clang associations is when they use words that are chosen based on related sounds rather than their logical meaning. So they might say something like, they went to the entry and they're trying, tying, sighing, dying, and the ding dong dangles, dashing, dancing. And again, it makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to you as the person listening. So just a quick story about the delusions of grandeur. When I was working in the hospital once, at one point I had two individuals who believed themselves to be Jesus Christ. And the interesting part about it is their delusions were so complete that they each forgave the other person because they believed themselves to be the true Jesus, and they forgave the other person for having schizophrenia and having faulty beliefs. So when in the deep having these delusions and having, when they are really encompassing, they can be, complete. And you would think that they would fight over it, but if you truly believed yourself to be, if you truly believe yourself to be Jesus, you would be a forgiving person, and you would believe the other person to be sick, and you would forgive them. And that is what happened. So it's really quite interesting how complete these delusions can be. And I do have a video, by the way, that I'm posting that shows you some people that have delusions. So while you're watching that video, you will see somebody who believes that they are being persecuted. They believe that people are out to get them. You will see some of these delusions. So keep this slide in mind while you're watching that. Hallucinations are sensory perceptions that occur in the absence of external stimuli. In other words, your brain is interpreting something that is not there, and you are having this sensation that you are seeing something, smelling something, hearing something that is not present. The most common are auditory, so the most common are hearing something that is not there. For example, voices seem to be spoken to directly overheard by the hallucinator, so they may have voices speak to them, or they may hear people talking about them. They can involve other senses, so they can feel things, like feel bugs on them. They can be somatic. They can be visual. They can have smell things. Another positive symptom can be inappropriate affect. So we could be in group therapy and somebody could be very upset and talk about the death of their mother, and somebody with schizophrenia could just burst out laughing and find it hysterically funny. And it's not that they're a mean person. It is that they just have completely inappropriate affect while they are having, active symptomology. So remember I said that positive and negative symptoms don't mean good or bad symptoms, but sort of more or less. So with negative symptoms, these are deficits that we are seeing lacking in the individual. So negative symptoms can include a poverty of speech. In other words, not saying enough. So reduction in the quantity of speech or speech content. So sometimes they can say a whole lot, but they really don't have a lot of meaning. So we would consider that a negative symptom. Other negative symptoms can include blunted or flat affect. So they can show less emotion than most people. So they could be talking about something really quite traumatic, but say it in a really flat way. And again, I have a video that the very first person that is speaking, you'll see that he has blunted affect. Avoidance of eye contact, emotionless face, monotone voice. They can be low or difficult to hear. Adenhenia, which is a general lack of pleasure and enjoyment, just very flat. So again, list of negative symptoms. Avolition, here it's listed as loss of volition, but it's also called avolition, is a loss of motivation. The way that I see that most often is lack of personal hygiene. So you'll see people who just, when I'm talking about lack of motivation, we're not talking about just not wanting to do stuff on a particular day. We're talking about not caring about personal hygiene for months on end, feeling drained or lack of energy, inability to start or follow through, ambivalence, and these are extremes. Social withdrawal may withdraw from social environment, seem to lead to a breakdown of social skills, including the inability to accurately recognize people's needs or emotions. And then the third category is the psychomotor symptoms. And sometimes we see psychomotor symptoms, and these can be awkward movements, including repeated grimaces, odd gestures. Sometimes people can hold a bizarre posture called catatonia. So you may see somebody standing in a very bizarre position for hours on end. And when I say bizarre position, it would be a position that it would be difficult for you to stand in or to be in that position, and they can just stand like that, just be in that position. So we'll see stupor, rigidity, posturing, excitement. So those would be the psychomotor symptoms that can go along with schizophrenia. So your book goes over and does a really nice job of going over some of the theories of why people develop schizophrenia. Some of the things I wanted to mention is the diathesis stress model. This is not just with schizophrenia, this is with any mental health disorder. And the idea is that people have a biological predisposition to a particular mental health disorder. And then if they are exposed to a variety of stressors, then that disorder will become prevalent. So with schizophrenia, the idea is that the person already has a biological predisposition to schizophrenia. And if they are exposed to different stressors, perhaps a particular home life or stressors when they were a child, perhaps poverty, and then they are more likely to develop schizophrenia. There are biological views that are very compelling. Certainly read over the twin studies. We do know that if one identical twin has schizophrenia, there's 50% chance that the other twin will have it, which is very compelling. There's also a lot of research out there about family members. There is the dopamine hypothesis, which is also very compelling and interesting in that we can elicit schizophrenic symptoms if we give somebody drugs that causes them to have too much dopamine. So we are able to mimic schizophrenia if we have somebody, if we give somebody too much dopamine. So there is something to be said about what's going on with dopamine. There's also some interesting studies out there about viral issues and things that happen pre-birth, things that are happening in the womb. So lots of things going on, but of course with all of the mental health disorders, it looks like there's not one definitive, this is causing that. It looks like there are a lot of things going on. So please read over your textbook, and it does a nice job of covering different theories and different studies. And as a summary, I just want to go over again the negative and positive symptoms of schizophrenia I have here. Please let me know if you have any questions at all. I will be very happy to go over any of this with you. And I hope that you have a great week.